M is a 1931 German film from one of the most respected directors in cinema history, Fritz Lang. It's my favorite German movie, and easily one of my favorites from this era. Many critics even place it among their best films of all time, and it combines historical importance and technical mastery with entertainment. M is a disturbing look at a child killer and how society reacts to the fear of his actions. Lang's film has a very interesting and unusual story structure, especially for the time. The screenplay was written by Lang and his wife Thea von Harbou, who collaborated with him on all his early works. I'm going to describe the plot a bit more than I usually would in my reviews, as it's hard to talk about it without doing so, but rest assured that M is not really the kind of movie that can be spoiled. The killer, played by Peter Lorre, is definitely the main character, but we hardly see him in the first half of the movie. Instead, we get a detailed look at the investigation. In fact, M has often been cited as the earliest popular example of a police procedural. However, the police end up being largely irrelevant as the main conflict is between the killer and the criminal underworld. For a while, the film becomes a tense thriller with chase scenes as we see the killer being hunted. And then in the final act, M transitions into a psychological examination of a murderer and a look at mob justice. Part of what makes the story's structure so intriguing is that Peter Lorre is undoubtedly the focus, but we barely even see his face until over 45 minutes into the runtime, and he doesn't speak on screen until an hour in. But once he does, he takes over the film and gives one of my favorite performances in all of cinema, especially when considering his short screen time. He does the impossible and makes the audience empathize with the child killer. Lorre was only 26 at the time, and this role made him into a star. He would go on to appear in many Hollywood classics like Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, and Arsenic and Old Lace. The supporting cast is all solid as well, with some unusual characters and faces. Many of the members of the underworld were played by real criminals, and this added to the realism. Stylistically, the main thing that stands out about M is its revolutionary use of sound. The film was released in the infancy of talking pictures as it came out only 4 years after The Jazz Singer, the first feature film with synchronized sound. This was Lang's first sound film, but it doesn't show, as M has a complicated soundtrack. Unlike many movies of this era that just used audio in a very basic way, M has voiceover and off-screen sound. We often hear things before we see them, and Lang pioneered the use of sound bridges, where the audio from the next or preceding scene plays over the visuals of the current scene. M also makes extensive use of silence, often greatly increasing the tension in a scene. Despite what you may think, this actually contrasts with silent cinema that was usually meant to have a musical accompaniment throughout. M has no musical score, and all the music we hear is diegetic, which means all of it comes from inside the narrative itself, as opposed to soundtracks that clearly aren't meant to be heard by the characters themselves. Despite this, M was still groundbreaking in its use of music. It was one of the earliest examples of a film using a technique called a leitmotif from classical music. A leitmotif is a brief musical phrase that repeats throughout a work, and it's connected to a specific person or concept. In M, the killer whistles "In the Hall of the Mountain King," an 1875 composition from Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg. The leitmotif is cleverly used to indicate the killer's presence to the viewer and is crucial to the plot. The cinematography is also fantastic, and Lang uses a lot of camera movement. The fluid camera work especially stands out compared to the often static films of the era. The movement is often combined with takes as long as 2.5 minutes, which gives M a very immersive feel. The 2.5-minute take even has the camera passing through a window, something we take for granted today but wasn't that common in the early 1930s. M is often referred to as a German expressionist film, a movement that started a little over a decade before its release. While it's certainly influenced by the trend, this categorization doesn't feel quite right to me. M definitely doesn't have the highly artificial sets of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari or even the over-the-top acting of Lang's own Metropolis. While Lorre's performance certainly isn't subdued, it feels significantly more naturalistic. M has also been called an early film noir, a genre that saw its heyday in the 1940s and 50s and was heavily inspired by German Expressionism. To me, M feels like the perfect example of a transition film between German Expressionism and film noir. In my opinion, M is a great choice for an introduction to this period of cinema. A lot of these early sound films can be clunky for modern audiences, and it wasn't until at least the late 30s and early 40s that films were relatively accessible for those who are just getting into the classics. But I think M can hold the attention of most people, partly due to being well-paced and never boring. It also just gets better and better after repeated viewings. For anyone even mildly interested in film history, M is unquestionably a must-watch. M has a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes and an 8.3 on IMDb, putting it in that site's top 100 films. That'll be it for this review. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.